Welcome. Enjoy the video. Subscribe and turn on notifications. Through the glass walls of my office, the city lights twinkled like distant stars, reminding me of another late night at work. I rubbed my tired eyes and glanced at my watch, 9:45 p.m. The numbers on my screen had started to blur together hours ago, but the Henderson account needed my full attention. My phone buzzed. Celeste's message read, "Dinner's in the fridge. Short cold. Just like our conversations lately." I didn't bother responding. What was there to say? Another missed dinner. Another night of silence waiting at home. The drive home was a blur of streetlights and talk radio. Our neighborhood looked like a picture-perfect postcard. Manicured lawns, identical houses with white picket fences. We'd achieved everything we'd planned. The successful career, the beautiful home in the suburbs, financial security. Yet something felt off, had been feeling off for months now. I pulled into our driveway at 10:30 p.m. The house was dark except for the soft glow from our bedroom window. Inside, the silence was heavy. I found the dinner Celeste mentioned, chicken parmesan, my favorite, now cold and untouched. The gesture should have meant something, but lately everything between us felt mechanical, like we were just going through the motions. Upstairs, Celeste pretended to be asleep. I knew her well enough to recognize her breathing wasn't deep enough for real sleep. The space between us in bed might as well have been an ocean. I wanted to reach out, to say something, but words had never been my strong suit. Numbers, spreadsheets, financial projections, those made sense. Emotions were messier, harder to quantify. I stared at the ceiling, thinking about how we got here. When did our conversations become nothing more than scheduling updates and grocery lists? When did I stop noticing the way her eyes used to light up when she laughed? There was something else, too, a restlessness in her I couldn't quite understand. Sometimes I'd catch her staring into space with an expression I didn't recognize, like she was somewhere else entirely. The clock on my nightstand showed 11:15 p.m. Another day done, identical to the ones before it. I closed my eyes, knowing tomorrow would bring more of the same, more spreadsheets, more silence, more distance between us. Being married to Celeste for 7 years taught me to notice the subtle changes in her behavior. That morning, her usual composed demeanor cracked when her phone buzzed during breakfast. Her face went pale, fingers trembling as she read the message. I lowered my newspaper, watching her over the rim of my coffee cup. She excused herself from the table, disappearing into the hallway. The sound of her hushed voice drifted from behind the closed door of our bedroom. The following week, Celeste grew more distant. Her mind wandered during our conversations about monthly expenses and weekend plans. The facade of our perfect suburban life showed cracks I couldn't ignore. Then came the night she dropped the bomb. "I'm meeting an old friend tomorrow," she announced while loading the dishwasher. Her casual tone felt rehearsed. "Someone I know?" "No, someone from before." Before meant her life prior to our marriage, the chapter she kept locked away. "This friend have a name?" "Ah, Malik." She closed the dishwasher with more force than necessary. "He just got out of prison." My jaw clenched. A knot formed in my stomach as I processed this information. Prison. People change, Ryan. The next day, I couldn't focus at work. Numbers blurred on spreadsheets as my mind conjured scenarios of Celeste meeting an ex-con. I left the office early, driving past the cafe where she said they'd meet. Her car wasn't there. I found it parked outside a rundown bar in the industrial district instead. The neon sign flickered, "Jake's," in red letters. Through the grimy windows, I spotted Celeste at a corner table. She wasn't alone. A tall black man commanded attention at the head of the table. His presence radiated authority even from where I sat in my car. Malik, I assumed the guy with the sleeve tattoos was him, sat next to Celeste, talking animatedly. The way she leaned forward, captivated by their conversation, made my chest tighten. But it was the interaction between Celeste and the leader that got under my skin. Every time he spoke, her eyes locked onto him. He carried himself with the confidence of someone used to being in charge. When he smiled at her, I saw a flash of the wild girl she used to be reflect in her expression. I watched them for an hour, my hands gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. More people joined their table, all carrying that same dangerous energy. This wasn't just a reunion with an old friend. This was Celeste stepping back into a world she'd left behind, a world that had no place in our carefully constructed life. When she finally came home that night, the scent of cigarette smoke clung to her clothes. Her eyes held a spark I hadn't seen in years. "How was your meeting with Malik?" I kept my voice neutral. "Good. Really good." She kicked off her heels. "He's got a whole new life now. New friends." "Including their leader?" Celeste froze mid-motion. Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Were you following me? I drove by the cafe, found you somewhere else entirely." "His name is Kale," she said, after a long pause. "And yes, he's their leader. But it's not what you think." "What exactly am I thinking, Celeste?" She didn't answer, just headed upstairs for a shower. I stood in our kitchen, surrounded by all the trappings of our comfortable suburban existence, feeling like I was watching it all start to unravel. Celeste started coming home late more frequently. At first, it was book club meetings that ran overtime. Then yoga classes that supposedly helped her find balance. The excuses piled up like unpaid bills. I noticed the small details. The lingering scent of cigarette smoke on her clothes, though she'd quit years ago. The way her phone stayed face down on the counter. How she'd shower immediately after coming home, even at 2 a.m. Her eyes carried a spark I hadn't seen in years. One night, I checked our joint credit card statement. Multiple charges at places I'd never heard of. The Circle, the Den, underground venues and parts of town where my clients would never set foot. She walked through the door at midnight, her hair disheveled, wearing clothes I didn't recognize. The old Celeste would have chosen sensible slacks and sweaters. This version of my wife wore leather and dark lipstick. "Work dinner ran late," she said, not meeting my eyes. "Sarah from accounting had a breakdown about her divorce." I watched her rush upstairs to shower, knowing Sarah from accounting didn't exist. The lie hung between us like smoke. Later that week, I followed her. She drove to a warehouse district where music thumped through concrete walls. A tall, well-built black man stood at the entrance, commanding attention from everyone around him. When Celeste approached, his smile carried a familiarity that made my stomach turn. I watched my wife disappear into the building with this stranger, Kale. I later learned was his name. Through the crowd, I glimpsed them together. He whispered in her ear. She laughed, free and wild, like she used to years ago. Before me, before our carefully constructed life in the suburbs. The parties became more frequent. 3 times a week she'd vanish into the night. Her excuses grew more elaborate. Charity events, women's empowerment seminars, late-night yoga retreats. Each lie delivered with practiced ease, like she was reading from a script. I buried myself in work, pretending not to notice the growing distance between us. Our conversations became transactional, discussing bills, schedules, household maintenance. The space beside me in bed grew cold more often than not. The rational part of my brain told me I was being paranoid. Celeste was my wife. We'd built a life together. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The way she'd zone out during conversations, checking her phone when she thought I wasn't looking, the slight smile that would cross her face when reading certain texts. I kept my observations to myself. Each morning I'd kissed her goodbye, go to work, handle my clients' portfolios, and pretend everything was normal. But at night, I'd lie awake, cataloging all the small changes, trying to piece together what was happening. Then she started dressing differently. Nothing dramatic. Shorter skirt here, a tighter top there. Makeup when she used to go barefaced. High heels replacing her usual flats. She'd say she was just feeling like a change, but the timing felt deliberate. I started checking her location through our shared phone account. Most days aligned with her story, mostly grocery store, gym, coffee with friends, but there were gaps, times when her phone would go dark for hours. When I'd ask about her day, those periods never came up in her recounting. The woman I'd married was becoming a stranger, and I had no idea how to bridge the growing distance between us. I considered confronting her, but without concrete evidence, it would just push her further away. So I watched, and waited, and tried to ignore the sinking feeling in my gut that told me my marriage was unraveling. I tried to remember the last time we'd really talked, not just about bills or schedules or household matters. The silence between us had grown so gradually that I hadn't noticed it building until it became deafening. Now it filled every room of our house, heavy with unspoken questions. One evening I sat in my darkened home office, staring at the glowing screen of my laptop. The GPS tracker showed Celeste's location in the industrial district, a stark contrast to the coffee shop where she claimed to be meeting Sarah. My fingers drummed against the desk, while I watched the little dot remain stationary for over an hour. The front door clicked open around 9. I heard her heels on the hardwood, followed by her humming some unfamiliar tune. I closed my laptop and walked to the kitchen where she was pouring herself a glass of wine. "How was coffee with Sarah?" "Oh, you know how she gets. Once she starts talking about her divorce, time just flies." She took a long sip, not meeting my eyes. "Interesting. Because according to your location, you spent the evening near the old warehouse district." Her hand tightened around the wine glass. "Are you tracking me now?" "Don't deflect. Why were you there?" "This is exactly your problem, Orion. You're so damn controlling. I can't breathe without you analyzing my every move." She set down her glass hard enough that wine sloshed over the rim. "I wouldn't need to track you if you'd just be honest with me." "Honest? Like secretly installing tracking software isn't a betrayal of trust?" Her voice rose with each word. "You want to talk about honesty while you're spying on me?" I felt something inside me shut down, like a door slowly closing. The familiar numbness crept in, the same one that appeared whenever we fought. But underneath it, determination crystallized. "You're turning this around on me instead of explaining why you lied." "I don't have to explain myself to my jailer." She grabbed her wineglass and pushed past me. "When you decide to stop treating me like a prisoner, maybe we can have a real conversation." I watched her storm upstairs, leaving me alone in the kitchen. The wall I'd built around my emotions grew higher, but my resolve hardened. Whatever she was hiding, I would find out the truth. When I handed over money to the private investigator, it felt like I was signing away what little hope I had left for salvaging my marriage. 2 weeks was all he needed, he said. 2 weeks to dig through the shadows Celeste thought she hid so well. The waiting carved at me, slow and ugly. Work didn't distract me like it used to. Numbers blurred together, deadlines stacked like bricks on my chest. I'd sit in the car at the end of the day, staring at the wheel, trying to decide if I even wanted to go home. But I always did. I started noticing things I used to brush off, like how she suddenly wore perfume to the grocery store, or the nervous way her nails picked at the edges of her phone case when she thought I wasn't looking. There was this carefulness to her lately, a sort of staged silence that echoed between us when we shared the same room. It used to anger me, but during those 2 weeks, all it did was confirm the sinking sense that I wasn't wrong to hire the guy. The email came with no ceremony, just a single line, "Evidence enclosed." Attached was a link to a file, password protected. The PI had mailed a physical USB for insurance, he told me earlier. The digital copy felt quicker. I opened it immediately, and it hit me all at once. Pictures first. A grainy shot of Celeste climbing into a black car, half smiling, her hair catching some cruel angle of sunlight. A timestamp below read like a taunt. Midday on a Tuesday when she was supposed to be running errands. Others followed. Her and Cale outside some low-end club, his hand pressed possessively into the small of her back. Her in his lap, laughing. God, the way she'd laugh for him and not for me. Texts scrolled into view after that. I could only skim. Words like "miss you" and "soon" leaped out like live wires. She sent him photos, ones I won't describe. I froze at something he wrote. If Orion ever tried anything, he wouldn't even see me coming. It felt like a gut punch I didn't know I was waiting to receive. I avoided the videos. The stills were enough. My laptop wasn't the same after I slammed it shut, but I didn't care. I stood in our living room, the stack of photos and bank statements clutched in my hand. My chest felt like ice as I watched Celeste walk through the door, her face dropping the moment she saw me. "We need to talk." My voice came out harder than I'd ever heard it. She froze, her hand still on her purse. I spread the evidence across our coffee table. Receipts from motels, screenshots of text messages, surveillance photos of her with Cale. Her face went pale. "You want to explain this?" "Orion, She started backing away, but I wasn't done. 3 months. 3 months you've been lying to my face. The yoga classes, the girls' nights out, all while you were running around with that gang leader." Her eyes flashed with defiance. "You don't understand. You were never there. Always at work. Always distant. Do you know how lonely?" "Don't," I cut her off. "Don't you dare try to blame this on me. You made these choices. Every time you lied about where you were going. Every time you took money from our accounts to give to them. Every time you climbed into his bed." She flinched at that last part. Her carefully constructed defenses started crumbling. "I trusted you, Celeste. I worked hard to give us a good life, and this is how you repay that trust?" "I never meant to." Her voice cracked. "To what? Get caught? How long would this have gone on if I hadn't figured it out?" Tears started streaming down her face. "You don't understand. You've always been so cold, so wrapped up in your work. Cale actually sees me, makes me feel alive." "I'm filing for divorce," the words came out like bullets. Her head snapped up. "What?" "We're done. I've already spoken to a lawyer. I want you out of this house." "Oh, Ryan, please, we can work this out." I turned my back on her pleas and walked out of the room. I heard her collapse onto the couch, sobbing, but I didn't look back. The next day, she was gone. Through mutual acquaintances, I learned she'd run straight to Cale and his gang. She was telling everyone who would listen that I was controlling, that I'd driven her to this. I heard she was living at their compound now, playing the role of the wronged woman, seeking refuge. But it didn't take long for reality to set in. Within weeks, whispers reached me about how Cale treated her, not as an equal, but as a toy. Mutual friends mocked her behind her back. This suburban housewife plaything for the whole gang. News about Celeste made me curious. I decided to call the private investigator I'd worked with before. Just one more check, I told myself, just to see where the pieces were falling. Days turned into a week, then another. The investigator finally called back, his voice as flat and professional as ever. He described what he'd seen, Celeste moving in circles that could only be called dangerous. Cale, her new companion, wasn't just some charming outlaw. He ran a network that trafficked in fear as much as in drugs and money. His so-called crew served as enforcers, their loyalty concocted from greed and intimidation. And Celeste wasn't standing beside him like an equal. She was caught in the machinery, no better than a pawn being worked to exhaustion. She wasn't just tangled, though. She was trapped. The investigator described how they'd begun closing ranks around her. Any protest or defiance she managed was met swiftly, sometimes violently. Cale kept her from contacting anyone outside his circle, while the others reinforced that isolation. Physical restraints were one thing, but the psychological ones, those hit harder. The world Celeste had once flirted with wasn't some adrenaline-fueled escape. It was a cage, and she knew it now. I hung up and stared at nothing for a long time. Part of me wanted to feel outrage, to leap into some righteous fury over what she'd gotten herself into. But mostly, there was just this strange calm. Like her story had finally cornered itself into a place that made sense. She'd chosen this, hadn't she? The romance, the thrill. It had always been worth more to her than decency or us. I decided to make another call. Anonymous tip lines aren't hard to find when you know what you're looking for, and Cale's operation had plenty worth reporting. It wouldn't be instant justice by any means, but the wheels would start turning. Not for her, though. Not directly. She'd made her bed, and if she couldn't bear the weight of it, that wasn't my load to carry anymore. When Marcus, the detective, knocked on the door, I already knew. The way the past few days had unraveled wasn't subtle. It was more like a slow-motion train wreck you couldn't look away from. I'd made the call after piecing things together, not because I wanted to destroy her, but because there didn't seem to be another option. Something about the weight in his stance when he stepped inside told me the fallout wasn't going to be clean. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. Marcus wasn't that kind of man. Professional, but not detached, like he carried the weight of every arrest, every body. He asked if we could sit, and I gestured at the same couch Celeste and I had argued on countless times about nothing and everything. My throat felt dry, and when I motioned toward the kitchen for water, he shook his head. Not here for comfort. When he started talking, I didn't move. There was no shock in me. The surprise ship had sailed months ago. The extended nights out. The vague dismissals when I asked what kept her so busy. The flicker of something guarded in her eyes whenever her phone buzzed. It didn't all add up at the time, but the gut feeling that had been clawing at me since the beginning now had a name. Cale. Marcus laid it out in a tone that somehow wasn't condescending, but hit like a freight train anyway. Both gangs. Their turf war erupting from the underbelly into something too public to ignore. Gunshots in alleys. Storefronts smashed. Kids scattering from school buses because someone decided they needed to send a message with the lead. It had been a powder keg waiting to blow. And it finally did. The raid came next, with Marcus leading the charge. He recounted it like a well-executed machine. SWAT pulling up under cover of night. Debriefing so thorough, you could probably recite every brick in the warehouse. Flashbangs, screaming. Chaos spilling into rooms where men who thought they were invincible suddenly folded. Cale's name got mentioned more than once, some call-outs too late, others too incriminating for him to slip away. They'd taken down his whole operation, and not even he was slippery enough to sidestep it. But then Marcus paused, his words slowing like he was wading through something heavy. That's when I felt it. The crack in my resolve. A crack wide enough to let reality get its hands inside. She was there, he said, and that's when my stomach bottomed out. Celeste being tied to Cale wasn't shocking at this point. I'd already started drawing the lines well before the pieces fell in place. But hearing she'd actually been inside that den of blood and desperation twisted something in me until it threatened to snap. Marcus explained it methodically, his tone softer now, like he was pulling a knife slowly instead of yanking it out. She'd been caught up in the fallout when everything went down, not as an innocent bystander, but as someone tangled in Cale's mess. Evidence pointing to her involvement was everywhere. Receipts, notes, even personal effects they found in a room that clearly wasn't meant to be shared. Her name wasn't just whispered, it was documented. He didn't sugarcoat the ending, not his style. Celeste had been there during the gang's final stand, caught and then used as leverage, a bargaining chip Cale had no intention of playing fairly. From the way Marcus described it, she'd been roughed up worse than I could stomach even now, forced to face the consequences of a connection she must have known was dangling off a ledge. She didn't make it out. Nobody did. By the time he was done talking, I couldn't distinguish the sound of my breathing from the ringing in my ears. No questions left to ask. Couldn't even tell if I wanted to hit someone or sit still until everything faded into nothingness. Marcus rose, as if he didn't expect me to say anything anyway. He muttered something that might have been meant as consolation, leaving the weight of the room behind him as he shut the door. I stared at the doorframe long after he was gone, the silence blaring. For a while, I didn't move. Just sat there staring into space like if I stayed there long enough, it might spit out answers. But what answers were there left to find? The truth already felt heavier than anything I thought I could carry. The first coherent thought that formed was one of vindication. Celeste got in too deep, and this was the inevitability of it. Emotions tried clawing their way up. Anger, something like resentment, but none of it overpowered that dull conclusion. Her choices led her here, not mine. Not some cosmic accident, hers. I'd made the call to tip Marcus off when things started connecting, not out of spite, but survival. No apology welled up for me now. It felt coldly logical, like I'd done what needed doing when the alternative was going down with her. Even so, my mind couldn't stop sifting through memories. Not just the obvious signs I'd ignored, but the early ones, the glimpses of a person trying to wrestle against becoming something she couldn't stand. I thought about the nights where her laugh felt genuine, then the ones where it sounded hollow. How many fights we'd had over things neither of us had the vocabulary for. How many nights she ended outside for a cigarette after claiming she quit. Could I have seen it sooner? Done anything? It felt pointless to even ask. I got up eventually, pacing the living room as if wearing down the carpet might smooth out the jagged thing inside me. The marriage had been dying for months, but there was no satisfaction in that hindsight, only emptiness. Thinking back, I wondered if any of it was real, if her version of stability this past decade was just a performance, played out until the yearning became too much to suppress. Looking back, I didn't think I ever fully had her. Maybe nobody ever did. Shutting everything off, I wandered upstairs, not really sure what I was looking for. In the end, I didn't touch anything in the bedroom. Didn't pack her clothes or burn some symbolic box of her things. I just stood there, staring at where she used to sleep, realizing the chasm between us had been there long before Cale ever showed up. I didn't feel guilt. Couldn't, even if I'd tried. But I did feel that nagging sense of disrepair, like the life we'd built was never whole, just patched over so many times it finally fell apart under its own weight. I didn't hate her for it. That might have been easier. No, all I felt was clarity. Her actions sealed her fate, sure, but our fate as a couple? That was always a weight we shared equally. I didn't climb into bed that night. Just sat by the edge of the window, watching the streetlights flicker. Somewhere out there, people probably still felt less broken about their lives. Good for them. But for me, the only thing I knew now was this. Tomorrow had to start differently. No shadows of a wife I couldn't reach. No lingering doubts about paths I could have carved around her. Just forward. Clean and empty, even if emptiness was harder to carry some days. After finalizing all the paperwork and legal proceedings following Celeste's death, I couldn't stand being in our house anymore. Every corner held echoes of our life together, now tainted by the truth of her deceptions. I contacted a realtor and listed the property without hesitation. The sale went quickly. A young couple, bright-eyed and hopeful like we once were, fell in love with the place. I didn't tell them about the shadows that lived within those walls. With the money from the sale, I packed what I needed into my car and left everything else behind. The furniture, the photos, the shared belongings. I donated most of it. Some items went into a small storage unit, things I wasn't ready to face yet, but couldn't bring myself to throw away. I started driving east with no real destination in mind. The first few weeks, I stayed in different cities, rediscovering parts of myself I'd forgotten. In Boston, I spent afternoons in coffee shops reading books, something I hadn't done since college. In New York, I took long walks through Central Park, processing everything that had happened. My old camera, untouched for years, became my companion again. I'd forgotten how much I loved photography before my career in finance took over. Through the lens, I started seeing beauty in simple moments. A child chasing pigeons, an elderly couple sharing a bench, the way sunlight filtered through autumn leaves. The healing wasn't linear. Some days the weight of everything would crash down and I'd barely leave my hotel room. Other days I felt lighter, freer than I had in years. I reconnected with college friends I'd lost touch with, had honest conversations about my marriage and its end. After 3 months of wandering, I found myself drawn to Seattle. The city's energy resonated with me, its blend of innovation and nature. Busy streets and peaceful waters. I rented a small apartment overlooking Puget Sound, started doing consulting work remotely, and joined a local hiking group. Life began taking new shape. Without the pretense of maintaining a perfect marriage, I could finally be honest about who I was and what I wanted. The scars from Celeste's betrayal didn't disappear, but they stopped defining my every moment. They became part of my story, not its conclusion. I still keep her wedding ring in a small box in my desk drawer, not out of sentiment, but as a reminder of how far I've come, of what I survived. It no longer holds power over me. Instead, it serves as a marker of where my new life began. Hey everyone, if you enjoyed the story, remember to like, subscribe, and comment on the video for more stories like this. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss an update. If you have any similar stories to share, leave them in the comments and we'll make sure to bring them to life. Thanks for watching.